afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us on this invigorating, crisp Friday afternoon for our second presentation in the 2014-15 Lunch at Lawrence series. On behalf of myself and everyone associated with the Lunch at Lawrence program, I want to extend a sincere wish to all of you for a relaxing and delicious Thanksgiving holiday. Our presentation today is entitled How Marriage Changed, Gay Rights and Same-Sex Marriage. What does it mean to be legally married? That question has been the subject of much scrutiny and debate in recent years. For some, legally married means a one-man, one-woman union. But in some cultures in the world, that definition often means it's perfectly acceptable for a 45-year-old man to marry a 13-year-old female. In our culture, we would define that 13-year-old as a child, not a woman, and would not allow such a marriage unless you're Jerry Lee Lewis. He once married his 13-year-old cousin. It is a complicated issue, as the Texas law illustrates. Same-sex marriage is illegal in Texas. The state also does not recognize gender changes. So a transgender woman, a woman who was declared male at birth, but lives in the world as a woman, can legally marry a woman in Texas. In 2005, Massachusetts became the first state to recognize same-sex marriage. Several legal challenges persist, and the issue will likely be ultimately decided by the U.S. Supreme Court. Just this past week, court rulings in Montana and South Carolina overturned those two states' respective bans on same-sex marriage. There are now 35 states, including Wisconsin, that recognize same-sex marriage. These changes are reflective of a shift in Americans' attitudes about same-sex marriage. A Washington Post ABC poll taken in August of 2004 showed 32% of Americans supported same-sex marriage. That same poll conducted this past June showed that support had grown to 56%. Our guest today is Helen Kramer, a lecturer in Lawrence's Gender Studies Department. Her expertise and scholarship includes feminist theory, transgender studies, sexuality, and social justice activism. In addition to teaching classes on those topics, she also teaches in Lawrence's Freshman Studies program. A member of the Lawrence faculty since 2008, Helen is what you might call an accidental academic. As the author of 2 books, Helen was an in-demand speaker prior to becoming a somewhat reluctant member of the professoriate. Helen was invited to give a talk at Lawrence nearly 7 years ago, but her speaking fee at the time was rather steep and the college was unwilling to pay. So in true pragmatic fashion, Lawrence decided to offer a teaching position for the spring term with the stipulation that during that term she give that lecture. That part-time speaking position to save money on a speaker fee has since turned into a teaching appointment that is now in its 6th year. Those yearly contract renewals have resulted in a transition for Helen, from the Big Apple to the Little Apple 10. Helen grew up in the shadow of New York City on the south side of Long Island in the community of Oceanside. She is the youngest of 6 alternating boy-girl, boy-girl, boy-girl children in her family. Thanks to her dad's X chromosome and some serious family wishing, she wound up as Helen instead of Doug, which is what her parents' backup name was just in case that pattern was broken. Growing up, Helen really wanted to become a Catholic priest, but she couldn't get the Pope to grant her a special dispensation to become a man. So she began her career pursuing a theology major in college. On the road to commencement, she discovered a love of writing and graduated Phi Beta Kappa from City College of New York with a degree in English instead of theology, becoming the first member of her family to earn a college degree. 1 year later, she added a master's degree in creative writing from City College. After graduating, she put her education to work as a research assistant for novelist Walter Mosley, a position that also allowed her the luxury to pursue her passion for traveling. She took full advantage, globetrotting to Paris, London, Scotland, India, Indonesia, Vietnam, Singapore, Brazil, and her personal favorite, Burma. When not feeding her wanderlust, she embarked on her own writing career, focusing on the transgender community. A long phone conversation with a friend shortly after an episode of the Dr. Phil show, in which he dispensed some advice that was, in Helen's assessment, terrible, proved to be the impetus for her first book, entitled My Husband Betty, a personal memoir that explores the relationship of cross-dressing men and their partners. 3 years later, she wrote a sequel entitled She's Not the Man I Married, a more expansive examination of the role of gender in relationships. Since her arrival at Lawrence, Helen has shared her expertise with the Appleton City Council on issues related to domestic partner benefits, championed the diversity coordinator position in the city, and worked with various area organizations to combat the challenge of suicide among LGBT teens. She has served on the City of Appleton's Welcoming and Inclusive Committee and was honored in 2011 by the Fair Wisconsin Education Fund with its annual Community Activist Award. Now, having basically lived in two places her entire life, as you might suspect, Helen has noted just a couple of differences between New York City and Appleton. Her first revelation that she was no longer in New York City came on Saturday, June 14th, 2008, the day of Appleton's annual Flag Day Parade. She was amazed to see folks leave their lawn chairs and blankets unattended on the street to save their viewing spot. A scene she called a foreign idea in the New York City world. Her second revelation, stars, not the movie Broadway TV kind, but the awesome constellation variety. She did very little night stargazing in New York, but here she enjoys watching them. Her third revelation, how nice and friendly people in Appleton are. So please join me in reaffirming that observation by warmly welcoming lecturer in gender studies, Helen Boyd Kramer.
Is that on? Technology. As you see, there's no video or visual things behind me. I talk. First of all, thank you all for coming. I have been here, as Rick said, that was an amazing introduction. And you never know when someone's talking for 45 minutes what weird parts of things that you're going to say. So my family story, yes, I am actually Cindy Brady, same family pattern. Are going to come out. So I wanted to start today. First of all, thank you to Rick, thank you to Lawrence, thank you to the community for being here. It's an honor and a privilege being able to speak about these issues. The other thing that's nice about it is that so many people don't know, when a lot of us went to school, there was no gender studies, right? It didn't exist. So it's nice to be able to speak and kind of show people what exactly we do in gender studies, because most people don't know. Does that sound? I'm ignoring that mic. Okay, so let me get started. We have changed, obviously, our culture significantly. I can walk away from this, right? Okay. We have changed significantly in the way that we've thought about marriage in the last few years. And I think for a lot of people, and this would include same-sex marriage activists for and against, it's been fast, right? It's felt very speedy. The changes that happened in the culture and in the legal rulings have been both dramatic and in some places swift. So in Wisconsin, even when I first moved here, I certainly didn't expect to see same-sex marriage become legal in the time that I was here. And yet, here we are, 2014, 10 years later. It's only 8 years right after we passed an amendment to Wisconsin's Constitution in order to keep same-sex marriage from happening. Only 8 years, right? That's a lot of cultural change. and a lot of legal change for that matter. So as Rick pointed out, the dramatic change. 35 states have marriage now, 9 have rulings that expect to become marriage. There's one state, Missouri, that actually respects marriages done in other states, even though it doesn't have it itself. And now, of course, the federal government recognizes same-sex marriages conducted in states as federally recognized, certainly for tax benefits and other reasons. So what's happened recently? We've got the 7th District Court ruling that happened here in Wisconsin, which basically upheld the ban on the constitutional amendment so that same-sex marriage is legal. Almost simultaneously, a few weeks later, 6th District Court made a different decision and actually upheld a ban, which is why probably, maybe this time, the Supreme Court will actually take it on. They've kind of dodged it twice now. So it's expected the Supreme Court will actually take up this issue because of that 6th District Court ruling. So how does this work? In June, September was when the 7th District Court ruling happened, in September. But June was when the decision was first made by Judge Kramer in Madison to declare the state ban unconstitutional. So what led up to that? 2014, we've got 2 major rulings, a lot of hullabaloo, a lot of people actually got to get married. And yet in 2004, you've got polling that was absolutely the opposite of what we have now. 2004, there were 44 states that had some kind of ruling that prevented same-sex couples from being legally recognized. 10 years, again, it's almost completely flip-flopped. Now we're closer to 44 that actually accept or have legalized marriage in some form or another. In 1971, a woman named Donna Burkett wanted to marry her girlfriend. She'd fallen in love. She was quoted as saying why when she went to go to the county clerk to ask for a marriage license. She said, well, I thought that was what people did when they loved somebody. She, of course, was refused. The county clerk in 1971 said a woman can't marry a woman. That's just not part of the gig. And so she sued. She brought a lawsuit. And her arguments at the time were based on the fact that due process and equal protection gave her the right to marry. Her lawsuit failed, as did maybe 4 or 5 others across the states in the early 1970s. Amazing. So what's happened in between? What has happened in terms of the culture and in terms of the legal issues? So I want to give you a little bit of background just for the state of Wisconsin. 1982, what happened in 1982, right? The state is the first, Wisconsin is the first state to pass any non-discrimination legislation on behalf of LGBTQ people. First. Tammy Baldwin happened, right? Well-loved politician for the most part. 1997, the Assembly Bill 104 is an attempt to prohibit same-sex marriage, but it's not until 2006 that the amendment passes, 59.4% voting. Domestic partnership registry is created in 2009 in order to give some same-sex couples limited rights, subsequent defense, certainly if the same domestic partnership registry is held up. And then, of course, in 2014, we have the ruling by Judge Kramer. That 5 years in between, even 2006, 2014. So to give you a little bit of the background, right, of what happened in terms of legally, I want to give you some ideas of some of the important court cases. Most of you have probably heard the Loving v. Virginia was an essential case. And it's the case, of course, that creates the fact that legally, federally, multiracial marriages were possible. One of the most important ones, and it's still being cited. In 1993, Bear versus Lewin in Hawaii, if anyone remembers that happening. It was this unusual ruling that nobody expected, that in fact even the plaintiffs did not argue what the court came up with. And what the court came up with was that the ban on same-sex marriage was gender discrimination, precisely because if a woman can marry a man and a man can't marry a man, that was a basis for gender discrimination. It's the first time it kind of rears its head in that specific language. In 1996, federal DOMA happens as a result, to some degree, in response to the Hawaii ruling, right? The Hawaii ruling opened the doors, gave a whole bunch of people hope that perhaps same-sex marriage would become legal. And in 1996, we have a federal ruling basically trying to get out in front of the fact and prevent same-sex marriage from happening. But then in 1999, what happens? Vermont, right? Vermont is the first state in the Union to pass civil unions, even though it's not called marriage, certainly not called marriage. Most of the same rights were granted to same-sex couples at that time. And then one of the most important cases that was not actually about marriage happens in terms of the influence on how it happens. Lawrence v. Texas in 2005 is the first thing to basically decriminalize homosexuality. I say that to my students and they go, 2005? Really? That recently? It's yes, that recently. So the idea that there had been a long-standing, otherwise precedent for the Supreme Court in 1986 that had been in place for a very long time that did criminalize homosexuality. So the change, Lawrence v. Texas, was a dramatic one. The first time that we started thinking about same-sex sexuality in a way that made it not criminal. It's a gigantic shift in the legal environment, certainly. So that a couple months later, when the Goodridge decision happens, that's the Massachusetts ruling that brings together civil unions that Vermont had already passed and Lawrence v. Texas, it refers to both. The Goodridge decision, even to this day, is used often by same-sex couples in marriage ceremonies, precisely because it's the ruling that states that tradition is not a good enough reason to discriminate. And this had been one of the standing revelations through other court cases, that we had a tradition and a definition of marriage that was based on one man, one woman, even if that wasn't particularly articulated in the laws. But it's the one that says tradition, marriage is one man, one woman, because that's who's allowed to get married, right? It became a little bit of a loop in terms of the definition. But Goodridge basically says, yeah, no, that's not a good enough reason. In fact, we need to sort of vary the way that we think about marriage precisely because tradition isn't a good enough reason. And it as well refers back to Loving v. Virginia, that there had been another tradition as well that kept people from getting married that was seen to be outdated, and for that matter, based in races. Okay. So Goodridge is significant. And then in 2004, of course, what ends up happening is the San Francisco mayor, Gavin Newsom, everyone I'm sure remembers those photographs. First time people are getting married in San Francisco. There are photographs everywhere, right, of those first married couples. Except that Gavin Newsom, of course, had made the decision to allow people to marry because he was the mayor of San Francisco, right? It wasn't necessarily the law, it wasn't the law of the land, it was allowing people to get married. There's so much. Yeah, you can do that by fiat. Anyway, the idea that this causes marriages in California to take place, the ruling is upheld, and then of course what happens later that year is Proposition 8, which once again makes marriage, same-sex marriage, illegal in the state of California. So they certainly went through quite a wild ride. Legal, not legal, legal, confirmed legal, and then absolutely not legal by voters. Iowa is the next state. 2009, imagine. Iowa beat out the entire rest of the Midwest. Nobody expected. And in a very, very careful analysis of equal protection specifically. So the idea that there was an equal protection being one of the clauses in the Constitution, 5th and 14th, due process, both of those have been in play, but equal protection in Iowa becomes the issue. And what's interesting about looking at these laws is that years and years and years of rulings confirm that equal protection and due process did not apply to same-sex marriage. One of the most famous cases is the New York State Appeals Court in 2006 that declares, in fact, that the marriage is defined as a man and a woman because its intent was not to discriminate against gays or lesbians. It wasn't bound to due process or equal protection because its intention in terms of the law was not discriminatory, which is the exact opposite of the finding that happened for Loving v. Virginia, right? That was, law was found intentionally to be discriminatory, its intent. So that's dramatic change. Why 2006? There would be a different way of looking at this, and this is in New York State. You know, it's supposed to be everybody's a liberal in New York State. That's not true, by the way. I just had to clarify. I feel like when I talk to students in particular, right, it's an assumption that everybody's cool and groovy about everything in New York. The same-sex marriage battle was a very, very difficult one, actually. And there's still sort of ramifications and fallout that are going on as a result of Iowa happens. The other significant thing that happens is in 2012, 4 states actually vote for same-sex marriage rights. That's a big deal, right, because it was a voting population. The other previous sort of big votes that had been taken were for most of the state amendments, which were against same-sex rulings, including Proposition 8, including Wisconsin's. 44 states had voted that way. But in 2012 is the first time you see 4 states actually vote for same-sex marriage rights. It's an interesting moment in time. And then, of course, recently, right, we have 2013, the federal ruling. Edie Windsor, who's legally married in New York State, basically confronts the federal government in terms of what kinds of taxes she has to pay. She wants her marriage legally recognized by the federal government, and she wins. Who knew she would win, right? Could have gone either way very easily. And then so it brings us to 2014 in Wisconsin and the changes that have happened as a result of these rulings here. So let me back up a little bit and talk about the fact that the changes that have happened, right, are dramatic, significantly dramatic. And they also seem speedy. When you talk to people who have actually been doing activist work, the sense that this could happen was almost impossible. And there's a couple of reasons for this, right? 1971, like I said, Donna Burkett's case, a couple of other cases, maybe 4 or 5 throughout the country, where people actually try to sue because they can't legally get married, but those cases go nowhere. Early 70s. So if you look at that time frame, it's maybe 40 years of history, what has happened in between that time? And there's a couple of significant historic things that you can look at. And I'll be kind of leaning a little bit too as well on a historian who writes about marriage, and marriage outside of the issue of same-sex marriage, how marriage changed in dramatic ways in order to make it possible now for same-sex marriage to be more accepted. And it is in terms of popular support, the percentages of people who support same-sex marriage, even that has dramatically changed, whether or not anybody's personal opinion of whether or not it's moral or should be legal. In this country, polling has consistently shown now that the majority, at least, sometimes a very tight majority, are for same-sex marriage recognition. So in 1871, what's going on in the country, right? You've got a period of dramatic change, social change, the sexual revolution, the 60s, all of what the 60s brought. Changes in the roles of women, in appearance, in people actually doing something to change things like the voting age, right? One of the most important contributions of the boomer generation is changing the age for people to vote to the same age that they had to be to go to war. Dramatic shift. But people who managed to actually change a significant, again, federal law. Optimistic things happening in terms of people feeling like they can actually make adjustments. But the 70s, there's no hope, right? The gay rights community, the gay community in general, there's not even a dream of marriage for most people. One of the reasons I find Donna Burkett's story interesting is precisely because when she went to go get her license, she said, well, isn't this what people do, right, when they love someone? It was not a political act. It was not an attempt to gain all lesbians' rights. She just wanted to marry the person she loved. Simpler times, maybe, right? So in the 1970s, this is the most gays and lesbians, it's not even thought of. The gay rights movement is barely started, right, in the 1950s in the US. Early organizations on either coast, for gay men, the Madison Society in California, for women, the Daughters of Bilitis in New York, that become significant movers and shakers in terms of culture. But really, 50s, 60s, 70s, gays and lesbians are doing is basically just trying to be people, right? Trying to fight for the right to exist, to not be discriminated against. The idea of being allowed to marry, or the right to marry, the language that doesn't change as a result of that, it takes a very long time for that to change. So what other things happened? There's a couple of other important rulings that happened, certainly during that time. But culturally is where the drama is really happening. In the 1980s, that's the precedent ruling that I was saying in 1986, the Supreme Court ruling that basically did criminalize homosexuality happens in 1986. Simultaneously in 1986, there are a lot of people dying of a disease that nobody knows what it is. This is a dramatic difference precisely because you have for decades and decades in the US, the gay and lesbian daughters and sons moving to the cities, right, to leave small towns where they couldn't be out to move somewhere where they could be a little bit more anonymous, and where they knew other gay and lesbian people were starting to find each other. So tension certainly there between the urban and small towns. Just about 10 years ago, globally, more people live in cities now than live in rural communities on a global level. It's kind of a fascinating thing. The way we think about the world, right, changes depending on where you live and how you live. So 1986, back to 1986 in this ruling. So the ruling that comes out of the Supreme Court that continues to criminalize homosexuality and does it on a federal level is happening right in the middle of the AIDS crisis. Right, which is terrifying. Those of you, all of you, basically in the room, most of you, I could say, just a couple of younger people, right, who lived through it. The terror of what happened with AIDS and the terror around not knowing how you got it or who could get it. But in the meantime, in cities with big gay populations, the decimation of those populations is dramatic. The West Village almost empties, described as a ghost town at that time. Literally, tens of thousands of people dying from singular communities, precisely because gays and lesbians lived in somewhat ghettoized communities where they were accepted, their relationships were recognized, etc. And it's hard to kind of communicate, right, how dramatic that was for an entire community, entire generation to be losing, effectively, right, this whole generation of people. So one of the theories for why people started coming out in terms of gayness is that gay lifestyles, because you had to be terrified, because you often were terrified of being out or being outed, you didn't want anybody to know that you were gay or lesbian, there was a lot of code, right? There was a lot of ways that older gay and lesbian people would meet younger gay and lesbian people and explain how to live in the world, how to meet somebody you love even without anybody else noticing, right? These were codes that were passed on from generation to generation. How to live and not be outed. How to live and have nobody recognize that you were gay. How to find somebody to marry of the opposite sex even, and yet have some kind of agreement. A lot of gays were married to a lot of lesbians, right, as a result, so that both people could then pursue other relationships from within a heterosexual marriage. It was a form of cover. So when you lose an entire generation to death, to AIDS, those codes can't be passed on. There wasn't an older generation to teach younger gay men how to be closeted. It doesn't exist anymore, right? It's very hard to get that information. Very few, there's, the big cities again, little gay bookstores where there was no internet. I like to stress that with my students, right? This access to information wasn't there. And so in order to sort of live, and the anger around AIDS and the fact that people were not getting the kind of medical care they wanted, and the research wasn't being done on AIDS while all of these people were dying, that combination of a lack of information on how to be closeted, and the part about how angry people were, and how sad people were about death. And the reason a whole bunch of people who otherwise had no interest in marriage in particular, gay activists of this period are much more on the radical end of things. They believe in queer culture's possibilities as counterculture, right? They don't want marriage because it's patriarchal. As feminists of the period as well, right? We're busy rejecting marriage as being something that they didn't want. That gay culture brought something else to the world, and they treasured that. That was the idea. So integrating, becoming more normal, and getting same-sex marriage rights, who wanted that in the 60s and 70s, right? There were people who did, of course there were. But it doesn't become a focus of the movement until a couple of key things happen. And they both happened in the 80s. One, like I said, is the AIDS crisis. And specifically, the lack of legal rights becomes very obvious. People who've been partnered to each other for 20 years, one partner gets sick, the other person spends 5 years taking care of that person, sometimes 3 months, depending on when exactly in terms of the processes that person got sick, how quickly they died. And they went on, once the person died, and realized they had no legal rights to all of the shared property. I mean, that's down to like the vinyl, right? That's down to the collection of books. That's down to all of the things. And the poorer people were, the poorer that they were, the harder this hit them. When you had very little of anything, then what was left of your relationship might have been in the form of what record collection you had, what books you shared. And so the legal rights of family members, often, of gay people, would come in and collect things because they were the first connection to those people when the spouse had no legal right. Now, of course, there were plenty of families who did recognize those relationships, but there were plenty who didn't. Plenty who didn't in kind of terrible ways. And that's what makes the drama. You see hundreds of people, hundreds, thousands of people, losing partners and having no legal right even to express how they knew their partner wanted to be buried or cremated, or what possessions they wanted to give away or donate. Families often were very estranged from the person. In a lot of cases, these families didn't even know that their kids were gay. People would go to cities, and they would live as gay, and they would write home, and they'd come home for Thanksgiving, and they just wouldn't mention it. So a lot of the families that were hearing that their son had died of AIDS were also hearing at exactly the same time, exactly the same moment, that their son was gay. It's the first some of them had heard the news. Simultaneous, imagine that impact, double whammy of hearing this information. So this is one of the dramatic things that happens in terms of AIDS. People become aware of the fact that all of a sudden legal rights might be important. Maybe the bathhouses, maybe all of the other stuff that the gay community is famous for needed to take a back seat. Precisely so that the basic dignity of the relationship, the wishes of the person who had known that person most intimately for 20 years might be honored. Creates a dramatic, the arguments, believe me, are ongoing within the gay community, whether or not that was a good decision or a bad decision, whether or not gay people should have ever integrated with heterosexual culture in the US, it's still being waged, constant battles, whether or not it's a good thing. And for many of you in the room, that might be a surprise, right? That there's still activists who are saying LGBT people should never want marriage, because it gets rid of all the interesting, awesome things about gay culture, this culture of survival, hiding in plain sight, right? That gay and lesbian culture was for so long. I remember seeing Rufus Wainwright cover a Judy Garland show. It was remarkable, because we realized that when Judy Garland had done it, there were probably an awful lot of gay men in that audience too. But at the time, none of them were out. Seeing Rufus Wainwright, who's a very out gay singer, perform it the same, however many years later, 30 years later, and the entire audience, right? It wasn't just gay people, but the gay people who were there, they were out. Dramatic difference in the way the songs played, in the way you heard the lyrics, in the way you heard especially the trolley song. Sort of one of the anthems in some ways of gayness. So 1980s, that's where you have the drama and the tragedy of the AIDS movement. Simultaneously, you have the lesbian baby boom, which happened exactly because there were a lot of people who shared their lives who wanted children, or already had children from previous marriages. And the problems of custody became an issue. So on the one hand, you have almost in some ways a gendered issue, right? You have same-sex men, married couples, or couples together who were dealing with this crisis of being hidden or being recognized and urbanization. And on the other hand, lesbians who either had families, were already responsible for children from previous marriages or previous relationships, who had then come out as lesbian and wanted to share custody of the children that they had. Or they wanted to have children. All of the technology, reproductive technology, changes dramatically in the 80s. So it's possible for two women to get pregnant in a way. And some use the old-fashioned method and found, a good male friend. But other than that, the technology becomes possible as well. And so all of a sudden you have a bunch of people who are recognizing that because of their children, they needed to get married. They needed to have some second custody precisely because they're simultaneously living in a world where half of their gay male friends are dying. Probably the only time in history that gay men and lesbians really got along without arguing a lot. Because believe me, there have been debates before that and there still are. But as some gay activists described it in the 1980s, it was 10,000 points of kindness every week. Because there was so much suffering. So as a result, you have the lesbian baby boom creating families, at the same time recognizing these legal rights of their gay friends, and people start to want a little bit of a change. There's one story in particular, Sharon Kokowski and Karen Thomas. I don't know if any of you know this story. But they were a couple who didn't get married like most same-sex people, or didn't think about trying to get legal rights or anything like that. And one of them was in a terrible car accident that left her paralyzed. She had the partner had no ability to make medical decisions, had no ability to change anything. And in fact, she was blamed by the family for having converted their daughter to lesbianism. The father, in fact, takes custody of his daughter again so that he can make all legal decisions. She's moved away from hospitals that her partner can't even visit her. Takes maybe 9 years before her rights are reinstated. And in that time, in the 80s, you often saw the beginning of pride parades with an empty wheelchair leading them, precisely because of this couple. It becomes a symbol of exactly why legal rights are important. And that's when the movement, the gay rights movement, really starts to embrace these simultaneously things, both halves, if you see it that way, in a gender binary sort of way, both halves of the LGBTQ community are forced to kind of confront the fact that legal rights have become not only important, but absolutely necessary. So that's what happens. That's one of the things that happens, at least in terms of the LGBT population. But simultaneously, you have a bunch of other cultural changes, right? Cultural marriage had already changed before it was even possible for same-sex people to imagine getting married. What were the changes that happened for women in marriage? What is the divorce revolution? The sense that people could actually get divorces, choose to get divorces, not stay with partners that they were unhappy with. That's one of the things that has already changed. It becomes far more accessible to get divorced. So that, in that sense, the larger culture, having nothing to do with same-sex marriage or LGBT people, marriage has changed dramatically. The other thing is the love revolution. We think of both of those things as important in terms of the way we think about marriage. People didn't get married for love until recently, right? That's maybe the last 50, 60 years. It doesn't mean that other people who were married weren't in love. Of course, they probably were. But other people chose your spouse. Sometimes there was financial necessity. Sometimes, depending on the entire history of European government, right? These were treaties, effectively. Marriages created countries and agreements between countries. We don't think. I don't think anyone here has been married off in order to solve a war conflict in another country. So the idea that there's some combination of events, this is another one. So people believe love and companionship in marriage becomes far more important. A couple of other things. People get married older than they used to. Cohabitation, partnership with somebody else, even if you're not legally married to them, is recognized. Women start working. They have employment, labor abilities in order to actually sustain themselves and are not as financially dependent on men, and so can choose marriage. People start having sex before or outside of marriage altogether, right? Something that nobody was allowed to do. Of course, people did, but nobody was allowed to do. The changes in reproductive tech obviously change IVF, all of the technologies that allow people to have children who might not otherwise. To the point that right now in the US, there are more people who are single, more adults who are single than are married. 1950, that would have been a shocking statistic. The end of marriage. We do every couple of years. I mention to my students all the time that, if you live long enough, you see things happen over and over again. One of them is that people freak out that marriage is going to become something, or it's going away, or whatever, all of those things. But the reality is it has changed. It's changed in dramatic ways. It's just more obvious now because there's an entire subset of the population that can get married that couldn't before. The other thing that happens is that marriage no longer is a rite of passage the way it used to be. You don't become an adult by getting married. You don't become respectable by getting married. You can be adult and respectable and not be married. I think some of my single friends would beg to differ, but theoretically it is possible, right, to be seen as an individual and a person and a reasonably good tax-paying citizen, even if you're not married, or to even have children. The other thing that happens, of course, is that America's economy changes. Far less blue-collar jobs for men in particular. So the idea of a head of household or a family wage goes away. The idea that a man should be the one who's making the money and supporting his family becomes almost economically impossible for at least blue-collar people. Now you see people, if you know anybody who actually has a wife or somebody stay at home with children full time, it's become a luxury. The economic changes that happen as a result of marriage, it had nothing to do, again, with same-sex marriage, all sort of set the playing field for it to be possible, for people to even conceive of it. And in looking at all of these laws and all of the things that have happened, all the court cases, I kept rereading the interpretations of due process and equal protection, and I still can't find a good reason for why the interpretations changed. Granted, I was raised by Jesuits, so I don't take any answers easily. But the idea that there's a dramatic shift in the way that these clauses are interpreted when it comes to same-sex marriage is very apparent, and yet why there's a change is not as apparent, except for the fact that the idea takes hold. Right? The concept that you could actually get married as a person who loves someone of the same sex, that's exactly what happens. Right? This is a change. And then all of the other things that add to that. And most of us in the room, the idea is just, it was new, right? It was the concept that anybody could have. It's not that people didn't recognize relationships of same-sex people, of course they did. People knew, my parents who were Catholics, right? They had a very old friends who were same-sex couple. And nobody ever talked about it. Nobody ever said the word gay. Nobody ever said the word homosexual either. But it was known, everybody knew. They were just another couple in their circle of people that they knew. But the idea that those men could get married now, that's the place, that's where you have this kind of cultural, I'm going to say, magic, good magic or bad magic, depending on your opinion. That's where it happens, right? Is that the idea that, oh, I can actually be equal. Hearing people report, even in Wisconsin, the difference, even if you had domestic partner rights, even if you had all of the extra legal paperwork you could possibly have to protect yourselves in terms of death or disaster or custody, the difference in the experience of saying, my marriage is now the same as everybody else's, is dramatic. In a sense, too, the other things that happen in terms of the LGBT community in particular is that some groups start doing it after Vermont in particular. Freedom to Marry forms, starts getting organized, starts getting funded in significant ways. And then a couple of, those two important cases, Vermont and Massachusetts, happen. One lawyer brought both of those cases and won. And why this is playing out, of course, in the judicial is one of the things that is still sort of, so from the 6th district ruling, 2-1 ruling, the statement was, when the courts do not let the people resolve new social issues like this one, they perpetuate the idea that the heroes in these change events are judges and lawyers. Better in this instance, we think, to allow change through the customary political processes, in which the people, gay and straight alike, become the heroes of their own stories by meeting each other, not as adversaries in a court system, but as fellow citizens seeking to resolve a new social issue in a fair-minded way. That's the 6th district court. That sounds amazing, doesn't it? This is a ruling that just denied people the right to be married in a state that other places, everywhere around them, is now accepting same-sex marriage. And this will be the case, most likely, that the Supreme Court will take up. And the language in it as well refers to Loving v. Virginia. Loving v. Virginia's statement as well says, in common sense and in a constitutional sense, the state court explained, there is a clear distinction between a marital restriction based merely upon race and one based upon the fundamental difference in sex. So how that's going to play out could be really interesting. There is language even in Loving v. Virginia, which was drawn on heavily by Posner in the 7th District Court. In fact, if you want to read, I think, one of the snarkiest rulings ever, Richard Posner's ruling in the 7th District Court is just remarkable reading. It's funny. His patience is very limited, and it shows. In terms of the arguments being made, because arguments are being made over and over, and he doesn't. But what's interesting about this ultimately is why, in fact, he ruled the way he did. What was the kind of evidence that he looked at? And that's what's interesting to me as a gender studies person, to have Richard Posner, a Reagan appointee, draw on the works of someone like Kinsey in terms of sexuality. The fact that Kinsey established that we are not just gay or straight, that there's a spectrum of fantasy, action, and behavior in between. That maybe these things are not necessarily a binary, maybe it's more complicated. He draws on Kinsey, certainly, and he draws on Stephanie Prince, who's a historian of marriage, to talk about as well these changes. And it's interesting to see that he's drawing from these resources that are not just interpretations of equal protection or due process, but looking at the kind of cultural changes. It's another thing that happens in other interpretations. Massachusetts actually starts looking at same-sex marriages in the European Union precisely as well. So judges are paying attention. We like to think of these rulings, right, as wholly objective, and that there is no dramatic interpretation. But like I said, I keep looking at the rulings, and I can't see it. I can't find the moment in the language that says all of a sudden now we're going to consider gays and lesbians under the rubric of equal protection. When exactly did gays and lesbians become citizens in such a way that these rulings start to reflect it? To reflect the idea that citizens in particular should have the same rights as all the other citizens, right? You have to have very exceptional reasons for why to withhold American citizens from most of the rights that other people have. Normally it's things like felonies, right? Something that has happened in the individual's life, but not as a class. We consistently, as a culture, right, civil rights includes more people, not fewer. But why it happens? It's a mystery. I keep reading, like I said, I've been reading a lot of court documents. They're not always exciting reading. But looking at the language of equal protection and due process really doesn't reveal the answers. It's not like the words change, it's like the meaning of those words change. But who exactly was going to be considered and who judges were going to take into account. And that's one of the reasons why I pointed out Lawrence v. Texas, and particularly the decriminalization of homosexuality is a huge thing, 2005. And there are other cultural things that lead up to why that happened. Kinsey is another reason why Lawrence v. Texas is ruled the way it is. But to actually pull out all of these different strands and strings of thought that change it. You can't see a moment in the text. There is no moment in the text where everybody says, okay, well now we're good with this. Or we're not good with this, but we understand this seems to be the way things are going. Reluctant, there's a lot of reluctant willingness in this case. Osner, again, who I'm sure his opinions will be drawn on if the Supreme Court takes it on because he's that kind of lawyer, actually rules ultimately not in favor of equal protection of the gay and lesbians who want to be married. He rules in favor of the equal protection of their children, not the actual people themselves. It is in some ways remarkably pro-family, pro-child. It's a conservative judge. It is in some ways the most conservative ruling you could do in favor of same-sex marriage. Because it's precisely for the children. There's an acknowledgement, of course, that gay and lesbian people have children. And a great deal of evidence given pro and con, whether or not same-sex parents are better, worse, different. They often do have a lot more effort to go through in order to have children, right? And it's one of the funniest parts of Posner is talking about the fact that, you know, the arguments that were made in terms of reproduction, that only people who can reproduce should be married, which is, you know, wildly offensive to a whole bunch of other people for various reasons. Postmenopausal women in particular, right? Imagine, you can't get married anymore. Anyway, the idea, taking that argument ad absurdum, but taking the idea that you can't look at the fact that there's no way around the fact that same-sex couples have children. A lot of them at this point. And sometimes, again, from previous relationships, but the effort that's put in. And one of his jokes is that really, so we benefit heterosexual couples who are careless about the ways they reproduce, who have children accidentally. We give them the benefit of marriage in order to try to stem their behavior a little. It's the funniest ruling ever, really, I promise. If you're ever going to do a ruling, it's a good one. And the other one, and he says that then on the same hand, these couples will go through tremendous legal obstacles and sometimes medical obstacles in order to have children, who work very hard, who absolutely know that they want to be parents, who are prepared for being parents, We tell them that they can't get married because they can't have children accidentally. It's amazing. And that's his argument. It's on behalf of the children of these couples. And I find that amazing because, again, it provides this kind of interesting way of saying, how do you change an interpretation of due process that has been re-ruled, certified over and over and over again that excludes gays and lesbians? And his ruling is that no, in fact, it's not about them. It's about their children. It's unfair to their children. They're not receiving equal protection. The kids aren't receiving equal protection if their parents do not get the benefits that all of the other parents of their friends are getting. It basically places those children at the apex of intersecting problems. What do you do then if you have a custody case? What do you do when you have somebody who has a child and wants a second partner to have custody of that child? There's a lot of legal work to go through. And his argument is that you shouldn't have to. If someone is raising a child, they should be able to raise the child. And some of the people who made these arguments also said, we don't restrict parenting to a lot of people. People who don't pay child payments, right? They're not barred from getting marriage. And so all of these are like loopholes. But again, I keep looking at the words, and I don't see anything, except for the fact that we've said equal protection. We now consider gays and lesbians actual full citizens. But even there, we can't necessarily say that out loud, so we can protect their children instead. It's a long way to go if we're actually going to view same-sex couples as equal in terms of marriage. Even though in terms of the numbers, it's amazing, right? 44. Federal things, the idea, right, as somebody who studies feminist history, suffrage happened far sooner federally. There was maybe only 20 states that had suffrage by the time it's federally recognized. It's dramatic. We're at 44 now. It's really amazing. Exactly the opposite of 2004. It's exactly the opposite 10 years later. Also kind of amazing. Anyway, so in conclusion, what changed? Other than everything. The way that marriage works, the way we think about marriage, what we use marriage for, how we want to be married, whether or not we think we have a companion in life as opposed to a co-parent or a legal partner or a breadwinner. Now more and more, it's the educated women. I'm sure some of you heard that when you were younger. Educated women are never going to get married, right? You can't get too smart as a woman because that's not attractive in a mate, and it was true. That's the weird thing if you look at the numbers. But now that's different. Now educated women are the ones who are getting married more often. The more degrees, more likely it is that they're going to be married. My students love hearing that. But the sense that this is another change, right? These are all of the kinds of changes that happen in order to put this in place. But if we hadn't already redefined marriage, and we redefined it in ways that basically we didn't pay attention. We knew what was happening. I mean, everybody saw people getting divorced in the 70s and 80s more frequently. For those of you who are old enough, you remember nobody ever did that. Nobody ever talked about having sex outside of marriage. Either right now, everybody does. You can't get people to shut up about it. So these are the dramatic combinations of things. And there's more. Of course, there's a ton of other things that I could include in sort of what made things change. There are certainly other stories, like the Kowalski story, of couples who found themselves, fairly recent ones in Florida, lesbian partner who didn't get to watch, basically her partner died because Florida, the hospital, prevented her from being in a room with her. Still current cases, and these are the cases that people tell each other, these are the cases that people hear about. So the dramatic cases. But the reality is, they're the same cases as we started hearing about in the 80s. And yet, something still different has changed. And I don't have an answer. You're all looking at me as if I will. No. It's the reality is it's subtle and it has been dramatic, but in ways that allowed us to not necessarily notice how seismic the changes have been. In some ways, very much American politics, right? Seismic changes, slow, argued, embittered in some cases, tiny steps forward. Thank you very much for coming.